All right, here we go. Today's date is 12/9/2015. Title of the section is going to be Living Things and Their Environment. All right, so the other day we were doing our lab and we were taking a look at different pictures. We noticed that there were non-living and living things that were in each one of the pictures. And sometimes you would hear me refer to something as an organism. So we need to give a definition of an organism. Okay, an organism is a living thing. Okay, so what's going to happen is that I'm not going to say, when we're talking about this stuff, I'm not going to say, oh, that's a living thing, or that's not a living thing. I'm going to refer to it as being an organism. So if we were to talk about the grass outside, okay, it is a organism. Okay, if we're talking about a tree, it is a organism. If we're talking about Allison, she is a organism, okay? Because she is a living thing. So living things are going to have habitats, and they're going to have places where they can live. And within those habitats, organisms need to be provided with food, water, shelter, and space to reproduce. Otherwise, it is not going to be able to live there. Okay? And if you remember earlier this year, there was tons and tons of geese that were out over by the river. You guys remember that a little bit? I mean, you'd be out there and you'd just see tons and tons of them that were out there. And so what they were doing is they were using that as a habitat, okay? A place for them to live. Were they provided with a source of food? Was there food for the geese over there? Okay, what was their food source? Oh.
Worms.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Just drink like liquid.
No, just their food source right now.
Please.
Okay. Not a lot of food that's offered in that, but yeah.
Probably drink fish from the river.
Okay. So they had obviously some plants that were out there that they could enjoy. If they were in the water and they chose to eat any types of fish or any types of smaller microorganisms that were in there, they were provided with that. Okay, the Milwaukee River gave them that, and that piece of land that is over there gave them the amount of food that they would need to survive. All right. Was there a source of water? Was there a source of water? Yeah. Okay. The river that's out there, it gave them a source of water. Was there shelter? Josh?
Like some trees.
Okay, so if they needed to, they could have gone into the woods. All right.
Build a nest.
What else could they have done? Is there another place where they could have gone for shelter? Bolton?
Like in hollow trees, like owls.
Okay. If it was an owl, yep, it could do that. They obviously had the river to be able to move in the direction that they needed to go, but they were also able to fly, which allowed them to leave the area and come back after it's not threatened. All right, so shelter definitely, and then obviously there was space that was out there because they were all surviving. and there was reproduction that was happening. So that was a habitat that was suited for these organisms. So we actually define a habitat as an environment that provides organisms with food, water, shelter, and space to reproduce. Okay, so you should notice that there's a common theme. The organisms need food, water, shelter, and space, and a habitat is going to provide them with food, water, shelter, and space to reproduce. Okay, so that's the definition of a habitat. Josh?
So it's basically like the same thing as.
The organisms has needs that need to get met. The habitat provides that with those needs. Do you think that the Milwaukee River is just one habitat, or do you think that it's many habitats? Jack, what do you think?
Probably many habitats.
Yeah. Okay, that's a misconception that a lot of people have, is that one area is one habitat. Okay, it is not. Habitats oftentimes are multiple habitats for multiple organisms. Okay, so that's important to understand. Habitats have multiple organisms living within there and are going to be multiple habitats for these organisms. All right. A habitat is going to be both the living and non-living parts that make up the habitat. Okay, so it's going to have both the non-living and living parts. Why is that important for the non-living? Okay, I mean, like, honestly, a rock, how can that be beneficial to a habitat? How can a rock be beneficial? Ingrid, what do you think? How can a rock be important? What can a rock offer a habitat? What's that? Oh, so it can provide shelter. Okay, so it might provide shelter to some of the insects. Okay, Colton?
It may be something for like maybe like a crayfish could sit on a rock and take a nap because it's smoother than the bottom of the mucky bottom.
Yeah, so it can provide it with, again, a shelter, a place that it can go where it's going to be able to stay as a habitat. It's going to allow for that to be a habitat. So that rock could be a habitat within already another habitat. Yep.
The habitat of the insects can be food for like a bird.
Yeah. So now we add in food, that the rock is giving shelter, but the food is going to, for the bird, is going to be the insect, which is using that rock as a habitat. So absolutely, that rock again plays an important role in it. Josh?
Like if a rock is right next to a plant, it may have like minerals in the rock to make the plant grow bigger.
Okay. So again, providing shelter and potentially giving the organism a source of nutrients. Okay, is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
Could the organism eat the moss on the rock?
can the organism eat the moss on the rock? Okay, the rock probably isn't going to, but like another organism can come in and absolutely good. All right, so even though some things don't seem like they're super important, they all fit together to build an ecosystem habitat. All right, and as we work through this, I said an organism is a living thing, but we also need to introduce the term biotic. Okay, biotic means living. Okay, if we tag the word biotic factor, it is now the living part of a habitat. Okay, so we can either use organism, or we can say biotic, or we can say biotic factor to all describe living things. So biotic is living. So when you were looking Monday, when you were looking at the different pictures, there were a lot of living things that were in there. Okay, there was plants, there was other animals. Okay, so there were different things that were in there. There were also non-living things that were in there. And we tag that with a fancy word called abiotic. Abiotic is non-living. If we tag the word factor, abiotic factor, it means the non-living part of a habitat. Okay, so abiotic means the non-living parts. And there's a couple of important ones that we see in almost every ecosystem. Okay, some of those things are water, food. I'm going to change food, actually. I'm going to turn that into, we'll call that oxygen. Temperature. Soil. Okay, these are a couple of the ones that are important for a habitat to be able to survive. Okay, we have to have water that is in the habitat. The habitat has to have oxygen. Temperature needs to, for organisms to be able to survive there, it has to be regulated. Okay, if it gets too hot, the organism has to be able to withstand warm temperatures. Just like when we were looking at the desert picture, we saw that there wasn't a lot of things that were growing there that looked like it was very green. It was very, very dry. So any organism that has to survive in warm temperatures needs to have a way to be able to do that. Same thing for if the temperature is cold, it has to be able to survive in cooler temperatures. Soil, have to have an area of soil that obviously it's not living, but it has to be able to allow for plants to be able to grow. Or the soil has to have enough nutrients in it for things to be able to decompose. So abiotic and biotic factors work to make a ecosystem habitat. Is there any questions on those so far? That makes sense? That what we're talking about here, abiotic, meaning that it's not living, biotic, it is living. Josh?
Is a plant
Well, what's your definition of biotic?
like living?
Okay. And do you think a plant is living? Good job. Good job, yeah. There you go, you got it. Yeah.
I don't understand how a plant is living. It's not like it'd be kind of a boring life if you could hear anything see anything, smell anything, taste anything, move by yourself
Yeah.
at all.
That doesn't mean.
No, that's what you're getting into is dealing with the complexity of each organism, how complex it is. Okay? A plant has an important job to do. Okay? Its job is to make food for itself. Okay? Anybody know how a plant makes food for itself? Yep.
The soil that's in it, or like seeds,
Nope. Yep.
sugar.
Sugar, yeah, it has to make, that's what it makes for itself to be able to eat, which is called, yeah.
Is it photosynthesis?
Yeah, photosynthesis. So a plant, while you can't see it like getting up and moving around or talking or listening or anything like that, the plant contains something that is, there's an organelle that is called a chloroplast, which holds a green chemical which is called chlorophyll. And so what's happening is that the sun is shining and the plant is absorbing the sunlight along with carbon dioxide and water, and it's converting that into a sugar which the plant can use to give itself food, in return gives off oxygen. Very important that it does that because we rely on oxygen from plants and other green organisms to help supply us with some sort of oxygen that we need. It's also doing something else very important. It's taking in water. Okay, the water is either coming in through the root system that it has, so that's an important thing that it's doing. But I agree with you. It's not like it's some like where we can think, we can move, we can do what we want to do. It's not real exciting for the plant, but the plant is surviving. It is living. It is doing important processes.
But I still don't get it. It's like being blind, deaf, stiff, and all you can do is eat.
I'm thankful that you're not a plant then. All right, moving on then. Any other questions about abiotic or biotic? All right. Now, when we start to look at an ecosystem, we refer to things as levels of classification or organization. And so all of this stuff that we're talking about right now is applying to habitats. Okay, so what we're doing is we're making reference to organizing a habitat. We know that there are going to be non-living things, which are abiotic factors. We know that there are going to be living things that are in there. But we have to organize them in some way. The first way that we do it is when you look at a habitat, you try to establish what is the population. Okay, what is the population? A population is all the same organisms. Tierney, this should be able to get to your question now. We should be able to hammer away at it. So, a population is all the same organisms. When you drive into, with your parents or guardian, when you drive in, you guys ever see those, you ask them and then it says population 4,000 something or whatever? Okay? The reason why there is a population sign is because of the fact that when they took a census of the community for how many people were living in there, they were accounting for how many human beings that there were in the city that had a residence up there. Okay? They're not accounting for the number of dogs. They're not accounting for the number of cats, rabbits, squirrels. All right? They are strictly focusing in on all of the same organisms, all of the same living things. And those living things that they're accounting for are human beings. Okay? If we're talking about our example that was outside, all right, the geese. If we were to look at the population of that habitat, we could start first by counting up the number of geese that are in there. That's a way to organize the habitat. We have a population of this many organisms. we have a population of this many organisms, population of this many organisms, population of this many organisms. So population is focusing in on one set of organisms. Right? Does that make sense? All right. Do you have a question?
Yeah. How many times do they actually scan the population?
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head how often it is. I can tell you that it doesn't feel like, I don't know, what do you think? Is it more than once a year? Is it just once a year? Is it every 4 years?
Yeah, I want to say 8 years.
Okay, so not very often,
No.
all right? Yeah. So I don't know the exact answer. That's a really good question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
How do they know the population? Do they actually like count every single?
No, they usually, isn't there a form that's sent out to each
When the word.
census, like a
Yes.
census
Yes.
form yeah, there's a census form that comes and you have to fill out information about the number of people in the
Every
household.
household, and it asks you how many members are in
Yep.
Yeah.
So, okay, so population. Now, a population consists of something else. In terms of organisms, we can also refer to them as species. Okay, we said an organism is a living thing, but a species is also a living thing that has similar characteristics and can mate with each other. Right. So a species, kind of think of it this way. It's all of the same type of organism that's able to reproduce with one another. All right? And so we talked about the example of geese. All right? There's reproduction that's occurring. There has to be the same type of organism that is able to mate with one another. Okay? You can't take like, let's take like a lion and let's take a goose. Okay? Those two things are both living, they're both organisms, but they are different species. They are completely different species. You could not mate those two together. Okay? So, when you're looking at your definition, you gotta take, is it the same type of species? If it's not, then the two of them can't mate together. Okay? We're not talking specifics like, I know that there are different dogs that can be mated together, okay? And obviously those are able to mate, but again, you're taking, those are both dogs. All right, yes?
They can't mate because they're different.
Different organisms, yep, like totally different things, yep. And so then you run into problems with that. Yes?
What if it was like an ape and a chimpanzee?
That's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head. So, all right. Moving on. Next one is a community. Okay, a community now is going to be all the populations living in a habitat. Okay? So now what we're doing is we're taking into account all the living populations. Okay? And we're putting them together. And we're calling that a community. So if I'm taking the woods outside, if I'm taking the Milwaukee River and I'm taking that piece of land that's a little bit further to the north of the woods and the river, and I'm saying that's a habitat. What I need to do is I need to take all of the populations, okay, the population of geese, the population of cardinals, the population of blackbirds, the population of squirrels, population of field mice. If I'm taking all of those, I have to take each one of them and say that now all of those are together in that habitat. That's called a community. All right? So a population is just one group of organisms, but when you take multiple groups of populations, so you take multiple populations, and you say that they are living together in a habitat, we now refer to them as a community. All right? Yes?
Like when you're researching an animal and it says that there's like 3,000, how do I know that because you can't send up one?
It's a great question. In our second section of this chapter, we're going to take a look at how we do sampling sizes. And so I'll teach you a couple different ways that they do it. Yeah, they can't sit and count every single organism. What they have to do is they have to use some math that's involved in it and some formulas that they've come up using that math to try to make a prediction as to roughly how many there are, but it's not a perfect number. Yep.
So it can take
Yep, because outside, we know that it's not just geese that are living out there. We also know that we've seen lots of birds that have been flying through there. So we have to account for those birds, and we have to count and figure out the number that there are of those. Those are tagged in a population. Any other type of living thing gets tagged into a population. And when we talk about a habitat, we know it's going to be made up of different organisms, which means that a community exists in a habitat as well. Okay? And that's why some of you the other day when you were doing you were looking at the different habitats and you wrote down that it was a population community or a community or something like that. And I told you, well, that's true, but we're not accounting for the non-living parts. And so even though it was true that some of those things that you were saying about, your pictures, that they were populations, that they were communities, that was true, but we were looking at living and non-living things. And so that leads us to another definition, which is called an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is all the living and non-living parts of a habitat. And so that's why this was the better answer of the three, because of the fact that it's the non-living and living parts together. And what I was asking you to do with the different pictures was to list out all of the things that were alive, all the things that were not alive. And so when you came up to me and you'd say, well, I think it's a community, or I think it's a population, I could say, yes, it is, because there are living things that are in there, but don't forget about the rocks, the soil, the temperature, the oxygen, the water. All of those things are non-living, and so the best answer was an ecosystem. Okay, the best answer was an ecosystem. So to kind of classify and put these together, if you take either an organism, or you could say species, and you feed that, if you have just one single one, and now you put multiple of those organisms together, it is going to make up a population. Okay, so now you have multiple of that organism or species. Okay, so once you have multiple of those organisms, and you take them and you plant them somewhere, but you also have multiple organisms that are grouped together, those make up a community. And so when you have a bunch of different populations, the community exists, but when you bring in the non-living parts of it, it becomes an ecosystem. Okay, so it's kind of like how we get to an ecosystem. You got to start with one individual species. And when you have more than one individual species, it now becomes a population. And when you have multiple populations of different organisms, it now makes up a community. And when you start to account for the non-living parts of it, it makes up an ecosystem. Okay, so an organism exists in an ecosystem. A species exists in an ecosystem. A population exists in an ecosystem. A community exists in an ecosystem. Okay? They all exist within that one thing. The ecosystem is all the living and non-living parts. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, good. And then the last thing is, this is our last note, is ecology. Ecology is a branch of science that studies the way species interact together along with the non-living parts. Okay, so there are actually people who are called ecologists, which are scientists who study ecology. And what these people do is they study species and the way that they interact with one another. And along with that, because we now know that ecology is mostly made up in dealing with ecosystems, we're also looking at the non-living parts. So ecologists are people that study how species interact with one another and the non-living parts. And there's a whole branch of science that is devoted to this. So if you like working with things that are living and you enjoy looking to see how they interact with one another, there is a branch of science that is there for you. And that is the end of notes.